Hey, welcome to week 2, lecture 3. So far, we've talked about the secular and sacred divide and about how problematic that becomes for the lives of many Christians. And then we went on to talk about how heaven came down, right? This idea that when we really begin to think in terms of a life wrapped up in God's presence, that presence should impact and affect and influence how I live every single day of my life, no matter what it is that I'm doing. But I want to build on that right now, is that I want to turn to a particular narrative within Scripture that I think helps us to realize the places in which many of our people feel trapped so that they can't step into this spiritually formative relationship that we're talking about throughout this class. And the narrative that I want to look at is the narrative of the Exodus, and specifically the liberation from the tyranny of Pharaoh's economy. Now let me explain what I mean right here. So when God meets Moses, his statement to Moses is, go back and tell Pharaoh to turn my people loose so that they can come out and worship me. Pointing at that he had witnessed something in the lives of the people of Israel that was not conducive to their ability to pause, reflect, and give glory to the one in whose hands they found themselves. Because they had now found themselves positioned in the hands of Pharaoh and rooted and anchored in his economy. And his economy is one of production, that your worth and your value is only as good as your capacity to produce. Like, you've got to be a participant in the economy to have any value at all. And your place in that economy is one of production so that someone else can consume what it is that you're producing. And what that economy lures us into is the belief that we are only ever to muddle through life, and we ought to find sufficient whatever little provision we have to get us through as we muddle through life. And so the people who will come to call themselves the Israelites, they found themselves wrapped in that economy as they were making the bricks that were being consumed, and their lives were wrapped up in sort of a sufficient provision. I mean, you're going to see them point back to it when they make their way out of Egypt and into the desert. They'll say things like, you should have left us where we were, because at least there we had, even if it wasn't good provision, it was something. We had something we could count on. And that's where sort of people get trapped. They get trapped in this reality that if I participate in this economy that keeps my wheels spinning as though I'm a cog in someone else's machine, that it'll at least give me the stability and security that I need to muddle through life and just get by. But I don't get the sense that that is necessarily what is conducive to God's will and design and desire for their lives. Almost as if God hadn't created them to simply muddle through life as cogs in someone else's machine, but that their lives and their stories were to be caught up in a story bigger than them. Not a productive, consumptive story, not one based upon the currency of Pharaoh or the exploitive and manipulative and oppressive programs of that economy, but one wrapped up in this beautiful story of wonder and uncertainty, of risk and courage, one of liberation and exploration, and one that enters into this covenant relationship with God. And why this matters, and then I'm going to come back to the story here in just a moment. Because when I think in terms of people in my congregation that I've tried to walk alongside or work with in terms of spiritual formation, I find that they find most of their lives wrapped up in this economy of Pharaoh. That their lives are only as good as their capacity to produce. If they can't produce, they're often vilified as being drains on the system. They're often pushed to the margins and told that they have very little worth. That's what happens to the mentally ill. That's what happens to the handicapped. That's what happens to the elderly. They're no longer producers in the economy of Pharaoh. And they're not even good consumers, and no one can consume what it is that they're producing. So they have very little value to Pharaoh's economy. And the folks that I come in contact with have have really sort of settled into the sufficient provision that they receive, however little or however much. And maybe I should say, for many of us in the West, it's an insufficient provision, no matter how little or how much, because there's very little contentment within the context of Pharaoh's economy. We always feel like we either deserve more, should have more, or we just get by with what I have and we make do. But life really revolves around the provision that I get based upon this economy of of production and consumption. But what I want to say to them is that when you live your lives trapped by that, your life spins by the rhythms of that producer-consumer provision cycle. So your life, it moves not from worship gathering to worship gathering, but from paycheck to paycheck, not from festival and feast of our spirituality, but from consumer holiday to consumer holiday. And that our value is rooted not in our belovedness, but in our capacity to earn and consume and produce. And trying to invite people to understand that their lives are rooted in a story that's far bigger than that, that their lives were never to be trapped in this economy of production and consumption, but that God has, in His grace, invited us into a journey of wonder and amazement, of exploration and uncertainty, of risk and courage and boldness, and this covenantal relationship that we come up out of Pharaoh's economy. And maybe that's the disruptive moment of our spiritual formation, that as we're participating in the practices of the spiritual formation, we're coming to realize how much of our identity in our lives has been accosted by Pharaoh's economy, how much has been stolen from us, how much has been lost in that economy, and that in fact spiritual formation might just be the invitation to come up out of that economy, that we now find our lives wrapped up in the wonder of the vastness of God's chesed, his everlasting steadfast love, his grace, this abounding limitless grace, his presence that meets us throughout the deserts of life, providing all along the way our daily bread, not necessarily always what we want, but always what we need. And that somehow, instead of a lack of contentment, we learn to find gratitude, because in the hands and the presence of this God who's invited us to come out so that we can worship Him, we see the beauty and the glory of this God who knows us precisely where we are and gives us precisely what we need. And there's joy that I think we can find in a relationship, a covenantal relationship that comes out of that economy. And I think this is what Israel does and what Israel has to learn to do. That as they come into this covenantal relationship, that many of the laws that they even receive are the refusal to be entrapped back into Pharaoh's economy. This idea of the rhythms of even Sabbath. Sabbath is a refusal to play by the Pharaoh's economy's rhythm, where you work, hoping that I can produce more so that more can be consumed, so that I get greater provision. Instead, it says you stop. Like you work, you stop. And in that stop, you recognize that God still holds the world, and it's beautiful. And we pause to delight and refresh and recover so that we can worship and celebrate the presence of this God who's not only with me on the Sabbath, but who is with me throughout all of those other 6 days. That the very acts of the law are at times a refusal to be trapped back into Pharaoh's economy. And I think that's what spiritual formation invites us to do. It invites us to find new rhythms and new paces to life and new practices in our lives, where we're no longer shaped by the narratives of cog in someone else's machine. The narratives of our worth and our value is only rooted in our productive, consumptive capacities and how much or how little we have provided to us. But instead, our worth and value is rooted in God seeing us and calling us and beckoning us out and into, so that, and I like to say it that way, God calls us out and into so that. And God calls us out of the economy and into wonder so that we can bear witness to the faithfulness of God throughout the whole of our lives as we live in this covenantal relationship with Him. And I believe that the practice of spiritual formation help encourage us along that journey. So over the course of this week, we've looked at the secular-sacred divide. We've talked about how God is present in the midst of all of our daily affairs and how spiritual formation reveals to us how often we become trapped in the economy of Pharaoh and how God calls us out of that economy and into the wide open spaces of wonder, amazement, exploration, and this covenantal relationship of gratitude and rejoicing in this God who has found us where we were to bring us to where He is and into whom He is, so that we can find grace and fullness for our lives.